What's up, everybody? My name is Donnie. Some people know me as Elevated, and I have been an esports content creator for about 6 years now. And I didn't actually get into esports to become a content creator. I really found the space interesting because I played a ton of sports growing up. I played baseball in college and obviously played a ton of video games as well. And when I looked at esports, I just didn't really see the same infrastructure that I experienced as a kid growing up in sports with mentors and coaches and sort of systems to help me grow as a player and as a person. And so I was hoping that when I got into esports, I might be able to help develop some of these systems and mentor some people and, bring what I learned through my many years of competitive sports to competitive esports. And I've admittedly gotten a little sidetracked during the content creation side of things, but I'm hoping that with this podcast, I can have a bunch of interesting conversations with experts in a variety of fields surrounding player development and psychology and sports and whoever else seems to have something interesting to say and interesting to learn from, and just bring some more awareness to this side of the industry. We've all seen the flashy plays, but there's a lot of practice and things that go on behind the scenes that allow great players to become who they are. And I'm hoping to sort of illuminate some of that in this podcast. So I'm really happy to introduce the very first guest, who is a guy named Dan, also known as Danimal, who is the current head coach of the XSET Game Changers team and also worked with the XSET men's team at Valorant World Champions 2022. And he has a background in psychology and has a lot of really interesting insight into how to build camaraderie and teamwork and handle conflicts and that kind of things. And so without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into the conversation with Dan and let me know what you think down below. Hey, what's up, everybody? I am joined by Danimal, or Dan, the current coach of the XSET Game Changers team. And I wanted to have him on to talk about various topics related to coaching in esports and player development, and just kind of, I don't know, shed some light on what it's like to actually work with a team and try to make them better, and sort of what that means in the context of esports and gaming, just because it's, I think, a topic that is not really super well understood or discussed by the general, fans of your favorite esports, and even in the field itself, it seems to be something that's sort of developing at a rapid rate. So thank you for joining me, Dan. It's great to have you on. How are you doing
Of
today?
course. Glad to be here. Feeling good. Excited to talk to you about this. You have a great voice. Very resonant. I feel
thank
I, I feel
thank
I
you.
feel like I'm gonna learn so much already just listening to you.
Thank you. It's weird because, as somebody who makes content a lot, every time I hear my voice, I cringe a little bit, but I've
Of
had a lot of
course.
people tell me that my voice is good. And so it's like
Mhm.
one of those weird imposter syndrome type things, which maybe
Yeah.
we'll touch on at some point in
They're
the
all in a
conversation.
conspiracy to gaslight you on this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I like to sort of start off the conversation by just asking you what your sort of like ultimate goal or vision of a coach is. Like, what do you think the purpose of a coach is in the context of really anything, but maybe focusing on esports?
Yeah, I think it's a deceptively simple question that kind of opens you up into a lot of different intricacies. Because I mean, what does a coach do? A coach works with players to try to better them or develop them in some way. A coach's job is to win and to formulate the best team possible, and get that together. But I think that the the ultimate goal is to compile the best players you can and then develop them to the best of your ability, and then let the results sort of speak for themselves from that point. But you end up getting into it from a couple different angles. A lot of it is sort of trying to find the best ways to orient people towards long-term growth in ways that maybe they're not super aware of themselves. And I think that there's a lot of different things that go into it, but ultimately, it's you know, can you make sure that you're setting people in a state of continuous improvement, and I think that is the bread and butter. When you asked me that, I was like, we could talk about life coaches. We could talk about, like, sports coaches versus esports. There's so many different ways to take that, but yeah, I think the most simple and uh, specific way that we could talk about that, or non-specific, is just to win.
Cool. And yeah, I mean, even then, you could go down a rabbit hole of like what does winning mean in various contexts, right?
Of course.
Which is why I wanted to start the interview off with that question, just because it's like I feel like everybody's going to have a little bit different interpretation of what that relationship is with players, or like you said, could even be just somebody that you're life coaching or helping them develop.
Hmm.
Um, and so that development of a person towards like their better self is definitely kind of where I would lock in as sort of the main role of the coach. Um, but it's for me, it's not necessarily that you are like in a teacher student role where you're like giving them information exclusively. A lot of it is
Hmm.
sort of like a companion on a journey of self discovery to some extent.
Definitely.
And that's always a pretty complex thing because we all have our own process of learning through our own life, but then to try and like help guide somebody through their own process, which is going to be vastly different than yours, is a very real skill that not a lot of people kind of fully understand, I think. So it's
It makes me think a lot about like teaching pedagogy, like the way that you approach teaching from like a theoretical perspective, because you know I think sort of in terms of the entire like concept of teaching, there's been this move away from thinking about people as like receptacles into which you pour knowledge as a teacher, and more about like how can you create the conditions for them to sort of allow their natural creativity and like yearning for growth
mhm,
to remove obstacles to growth. And I think that's a huge part of coaching, is like, it's going to take me a lot longer, and I'm going to have a lot of blind spots as an external person looking at like what are the issues in somebody, rather than like how can I teach them how to help themselves, and
right.
how can I, as a coach, like create conditions for which their growth is at its most elevated, its most accelerated.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I mean, like you're working with a team right now. I'm also working with a team of free agent players,
Hmm.
and just that initial process of when you start working with them, there is so much blind spots. You're like, what? Where do I even start to try and kind of like have any impact in this very chaotic group of five, or could be even more individuals with all different ideas? And so I kind of wanted to maybe hone in on that of like, how do you even start to develop like a useful team culture? Because we hear that phrase a lot, like a good team culture is like very important to winning, but what is a team culture? Is it just like a group of personalities? Is it common interests? And how do you even go about starting to kind of like formulate one that is useful to the players as a whole?
Hmm. I think it's a really interesting question. I think when I first came into coaching, I made the mistake that I think a lot of coaches, especially in esports, where you're coaching is always, especially on like free agent rosters, like sort of this secondary concern beyond like what are the best group of players we can get. And I came into it and I was like, well, I've got to prove my worth. I've got to demonstrate, what I can do for a team. And so I came in and I had all these plays and, all these different systems of how I wanted to orient the team and everything. And I wanted to very much like control the team in a certain respect. Like I want to create a culture from the top down. And what I found is, you can get some development that way, but that's not really the best way to do it, generally speaking. And you want to, I think the best like way that I can conceptualize it is like you're trying to create a system in which everyone is pulling in the same direction. So it's not that there's going to be lots of different ideas about how to play, about how to go about practice, how to go about like on match days. What are the different just more Valorant specific things? What are the comps we're going to run? What are the sort of types of macro play styles or just plays in general that we're like interested in running? you're going to have a lot of competing ideas in most teams. And so, how can you make the team culture one that everyone is like? There's an established structure for how we can come to an answer that everyone is amenable to. And for me, I think a big part of that is just making sure that there's space for people to talk.
Mhm.
It sounds really, really simple, but making sure that there isn't like one or two dominant voices in a conversation that just steamroll everybody. Um, because what tends to happen in those situations is that certain players start to get a little bit resentful that maybe they're not part of the team. They start to feel a little out of sorts that like, well, it's just what the team wanted to do. But if I can get players excited about the way that the team is playing because they had a stake in finding that approach, or they had significant input that was built into this larger structure of how the team plays, I find that people are a lot more invested, and they're also uh, much more willing to take criticism because there's this like shared stake, this mutual respect that we're all trying together to figure out the best solution. And so there's a lot of different things that you can get into with that, but I think that the biggest thing is just to make sure that, and to the point earlier about like dominant versus more submissive voices, like there are you have to kind of sometimes bring people down a bit
Mhm.
that are dominating the conversation and say, okay, well, I'd like to hear a little bit from so and so, who I haven't heard from too much. Usually a smoked player, mind you. Um, like what do you think about this situation? Is there something that comes to mind in terms of like, do you feel like we're missing something here? Is there something that we don't get to see usually because you aren't a part of these conversations? And I've found a lot of good in terms of creating a very open, like responsive team culture where people are very like open to criticism, by creating that sort of mutual stake. So I've rambled a little bit, but
No, it's
there's
good. I
that's sort of how I think about it.
Cool. Yeah, I do have a kind of a follow up question that came to me while you were talking that may take us a little off the rails, but I did want to
Please.
kind of give a little anecdote with regards to the idea of creating this conversational sort of like contract with the players of where
Mhm.
everybody's bought into it. I I'm a big fan of sports, and I was listening to an interview with Phil Jackson, obviously one of the greatest coaches of all time in any sport.
The goat,
Um,
absolutely.
and would he actually I think I feel like he said that he took this technique from Vince Lombardi, who is again another one of like the greatest coaches in the history of sport. um, but it was at the beginning of the season he did this sort of ritualistic thing where he was standing in the court and everybody else on the team was lined up on the baseline of the basketball court, and then they would have this whole thing where he was like, I am here to help us, become the best versions of ourselves, and I am here to give you everything I can as a coach. But in stepping across this line, you are accepting this social contract of accepting me as your coach, that you will listen to what I'm saying and that kind of stuff.
Mm.
I don't remember like the exact verbiage of it, but it was
Hmm.
essentially like, because they did this little ritual, which might seem kind of dumb, and I'm sure there were plenty of like, especially the younger players on that basketball team, that were like, what are we doing here? This is kind of silly woo woo stuff, but
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
does create a little bit of extra weight because you did this thing that kind of seemed to have some sort of weight to at least some people in there. Um, but so that was the anecdote that I wanted to bring up.
I love that. I love
uh,
that.
and I can see your background in clinical psychology coming
Yeah.
through here with your the dominant submissive voices, and how do we have this
Yeah, yeah,
conversation, which is
yeah.
great because you're
Mhm.
totally right. There in every team, there's always certain people that are very vocal about what they want to have happen, and other people who are kind of going with the flow and maybe have some ideas, but because they're so hesitant to maybe put them forward, they don't necessarily come out as often as they should, and oftentimes they
Mhm.
get kind of overlooked. And so I wanted to kind of go really deep into a Valorant team structure here and just
Mhm.
say, what role do you think is, or actually, let me rephrase this.
Okay.
Do you think that each role has a certain personality that kind of like fits to it, and certain roles are much more vocal and other roles are not as maybe extroverted, I guess?
Wow, I love that. There's a very interesting question. There's definitely variance, right? There's
Hmm.
definitely like I've had um super quiet and super vocal players from lots of different roles.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that there are certain affinities that are perhaps like a little bit more efficient. Um, like for example, if you have a player that is not super like just in terms of their personality, both in game and out of game, someone who doesn't take the initiative themselves to think about what needs to happen next. I tend to think those players do really well on smokes
Hmm.
because you have like they have initiating utility a lot of the time, but it's also like if someone says like, "Hey, can I get a smoke over here?" Like they'll just do it, right? Um, but it's if you have that kind of player on like a KO, you probably have a problem
Hmm.
at that point. That's going to be an issue. Because if someone needs to be called to ask to do something and they're in that like super eye of the storm, just in the middle of all this chaos and they need to be told to do something, like that's probably not going to work. And so I think that can work. I think that somebody who's great at um, somebody who's great at like thinking in terms of where space needs to be captured on the map. They take this space, we're going to take this space in response. I think that generally, like you want a Sova fade player to think in those terms. Um,
And the IGL, obviously, that makes a lot
yeah,
of
of
sense for
course.
that role as
Which
well.
there has been a lot of gravitation towards melding those two roles that you
Hmm.
want. Yeah, your IGL in that role for that reason. I think that somebody who is very self-sufficient, a little bit of a loner, maybe someone who is uh, just most comfortable doing their own thing. You know where I'm going with this. It's very obvious. You want that on like a lurk. You want
Yep.
them on like Sentinel most of the time.
Right. And then you
Somebody
want
who's
the
just
attention, the guy who craves attention to be the star duelist on the team, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah, of course, yeah.
yeah.
You don't have to look too far for an example of that for sure.
Right.
But I think that there's definitely there's some general things, but I've had players who were just like, uh incredibly talented, but like not the kind of player who would take initiative or say like this is what I want, who will play a duelist role. And I've also had people who are like, hey, listen, dart this, smoke this, I'm going in, get like save for my op. Like, no, screw you. Like I'm
Hmm.
the guy in that role. So, you can have lots of different personality types within these roles. It's not so hard and fast, but I do think certain things like really gel when
Yeah.
you put them together for sure.
I would definitely agree. But I mean, like you said, there's always some variety because I wouldn't necessarily call like Ye, who I think most people would agree is probably the
Hmm.
best player in the world, or at least in the
Hmm.
conversation of top two, top three,
Yep.
does not seem like sort of like a hey, look at me type person. Seems to be very humble. I'm sure he
Hmm.
talks in team. I haven't really had access to the OpTic comms or anything like that, but
Right.
certainly is giving information. But he's definitely not like the same type of person who is always wanting to be the center of attention clearly. And so
Sure, but you can even see it in the OpTic playstyle, right? In
right.
that, like, some teams are like, let's set up our chamber with a bunch of utility to get their pick, and some teams are like, no, no, let's just let our chamber do their thing. And
Right.
OpTic is a lot more like that. Like, let's just give half the map to Ye.
Right.
He'll probably win against
Yeah.
anyone who pushes.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so that brings me to kind of an interesting point when we're talking about the like the personality types.
Mhm.
Um, I think that maybe you'll disagree with me, but I get the sense that in esports there is quite a bit of weight that's put on the ego,
Mhm.
like players with strong ego and strong drive to like prove that they are the best, that they
Mhm.
are sort of like the guy.
Mhm.
Those people tend to kind of reach the high highs of the esports world, in a lot of cases because they're actually going after it. And so as somebody who's kind of in this position to mentor players, how do you deal with mentoring? I guess like how do you deal with mentoring in a situation where there are quite a few strong egos
Mhm.
to deal with?
Yeah, so I think one, just I think it's funny, just coming from like a psychology background, that the way that ego is used within the Valorant community, like literally just the term, I think is a little bit of a misnomer. But I think that when we're talking about ego as a negative idea, it's usually comes down to somebody being defensive, or above critique in a certain capacity. So like, I just can't stand when someone has like a huge ego. It's usually because, you said to a player who supposedly has this big ego, "Hey, I think you shouldn't have done this. You should do this instead." And they were like, "Yeah, maybe, whatever."
Hmm.
Like, yeah, yeah, maybe you should get a couple more kills yourself before you talk to me about that, right? Um, and that's them defending their own ego
Right.
from the potential having to like lower it just a sec, just for a moment, to consider that someone else's criticism might be valid.
Hmm.
But I do think that, like, in the sense, the more like, what's the word, historical idea of like what the ego is, I think that it's absolutely imperative that you have some sort of ego to compete.
Hmm.
I think that playing this game is depletes the ego for sure. And every time that you have like a subpar game, or you have some sort of experience that is a setback, the thing that's going to bring you back and allow you to continue to compete and grind to the degree that is necessary to make it to your goals, um, is dependent upon an incredibly strong ego. It is like, no, I will get there. I
Hmm.
am that guy. And I think that this demand upon, like, I just want to have be on a team with people with no egos. Like, if you didn't have an ego, you wouldn't be here. You know, you took it upon yourself to be better than everybody because you wanted that for yourself. And the only thing that keeps you competing when things are going horribly is continually like falling back on that ego that allows you to say, like, yes, I will get there. I have the talent, because you don't know yet. You haven't proven it to yourself that you can do it until you do it. So something has to be in the back of your head telling you, like, I will make it. I will make it. I cannot surrender. Um, but I think that it's an interesting point. Aside from sort of the linguistic element to it, I think that um, a lot of what you can do as a coach in terms of mentoring a player like that is to call the attention to when something is just being defensive, of that ego. If you can say to someone, like, what does it take for you to want to win at any cost? Um, that's something that I've found has gotten through to a lot of those sorts of players. And they'll be sort of like, well, yeah, I want to win at any cost. Like, I'll do anything, and
Hmm.
it's like, okay, well, what if
Take this
the
feedback.
cost? What if the cost is taking the
Yeah.
feedback, right? What if the cost is listening to someone that you don't think is as good of a player as you, but has a perspective that you don't have? Do you want to win at any cost, or do you want to win on just the terms that you want, which is playing jet, insta locking, and never having to like uh, be accountable to your teammates for like the things that you should be accountable for,
Right.
and I think this is like a consistent theme, is like, everyone wants to make it, and everyone will say that they want to make it. They'll do anything, but ultimately, I think what comes down to making a champion is um, being willing to do absolutely anything it takes.
Hmm.
And one component of that is like, you see a lot with these kinds of players that they're very gruff with their teammates. They're like, well, I'm just going to say this, and like, if you take it poorly, that's on you,
Hmm.
right? But the best player, uh, like, who will stop at nothing to make sure that they succeed, is going to take the extra time and perhaps like do a little bit of personal growth in terms of being able to speak to somebody in a way that they will for sure take that criticism the correct way, you know,
Right.
because that is a component of winning. If your teammate takes that note properly, maybe you win a round next time. That if you continue to bash your head against the wall by just like saying like just get good and they don't get good, that's kind of on you ultimately. You know, you didn't help them. You didn't
Right.
bring your teammate up to the level to elevate you.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, communication is a whole nother can of worms to talk about as
yeah.
far as like how to develop good communication.
Hmm.
But I want to change trajectory here a little bit and just
Please.
ask you, how do you handle losing?
Um, as a coach, I think my uh, primary attention after a loss goes to preserving the unit
Hmm.
of the team. Um, Especially when I was a free agent coach, for sure. I have seen so many rosters just crash and burn after a loss
Right,
because
one bad
everyone
tournament.
started. Yeah, yeah, man. It's everyone's instinct is to like find the blame, right? And if you locate that in a person as opposed to the relationship between two players or how that might be not functioning in the way that it should to be most efficient, after every loss, you're going to get into this cycle of just kicking somebody because you know whoever did the worst. And ultimately, that is a road to ruin. I think that's pretty shooting yourself in the foot every time. So I think the biggest thing is after a loss, just trying to make sure that everyone understands like what are the true reasons for a loss.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of times it will be, you know, I'll take some time, make sure everyone cools off because if you immediately go into like, you know, trying to find the reasons, people will immediately just blame each other a lot of the time. So I'll just take some time, you know, maybe like half an hour or something like that, come back. Everyone's got a little bit clearer of a head. And then usually do some VOD review. Usually do like, okay, here are the pivotal rounds that went south. Why did this happen? Was it because one person missed a shot that they had to hit? Or was it because we didn't coordinate enough and somebody engaged on us in a way that with more coordination and like better util than we were prepared to deal with at the time? Why were we not prepared to deal with it at the time? And usually those sorts of questions tend to show people that the biggest difference in most games is not about like, well, we didn't have a good enough of a player. It was that the players that we did have didn't like communicate or execute their team play in the best possible way, and that's why it went south. Sometimes it'll be just shots, but a good, I would say the majority of times it's not really.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thing because I feel like there's so much emphasis placed on mechanics as being
Hmm.
like the end all be all of what makes a good player. And it's like, I mean, if I had to put percentages on it, it's probably like 30%,
Yeah.
25% of the equation, something like that.
Hmm.
Especially if you're comparing just kind of within the professional scene, it might be even lower. It might be like 5% because if
Hmm.
you're good enough to be at the pro level, even on like a free agent team, you're probably good enough to compete at like the tier two, maybe even tier one level, just purely on a mechanical level. But it's
Hmm.
all the other factors that go into it that are not there. And so, yeah, I mean, that balance between mechanics and like the mentality and you know just kind of like the macro game sense is such a more complex puzzle to solve. And it's really kind of up to the coach and like the mentors in a team to impart that like the to the other players or like the newer players. And it's such an interesting thing in esports because there isn't really like this long history of you know like I come from like the baseball world where
Hmm.
you have like you know 150 years of the game being played, and there's like this very established thing where you know the older players are sort of like the leaders of the team, and they kind of like
Hmm.
teach the new players like how things work. And then even like at the like the tier 2 level, which would be like it's called
Minors.
triple A, and yeah, in the minor
Yeah.
leagues,
Hmm.
the professional organizations will often send like their most senior players from their professional team down to like the minor leagues, aka tier 2, tier 3, to
Hmm.
mentor players that they just picked up that are supposed to be like the next stars, because they need to have this the more experienced voice in their ear to make sure that they actually develop to become the player that they're supposed to be. Because
Hmm.
I mean, I've seen, like, I started casting and analyzing this game back in First Strike, and I've seen a lot of players who were unbelievably skilled at clicking heads that are like not even in the scene anymore, because
Gone.
it literally
Yeah.
does not matter how well you can shoot people at a certain point.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. There have been so many like, quote unquote aimers,
Mm-hmm.
that you watch a compilation of them aim, or just I mean, not even a compilation necessarily. You just watch them stream, and you're like, how is this person not on a tier one organization?
Right.
And it's like, that doesn't mean that much. Like really, okay, if someone's an incredible clicker, that means they're great. They're going to be advantaged in those dry 50-50 fights, but that doesn't happen very often
Yeah. And
in a pro environment.
yeah.
That happens in ranked a lot. Um, but yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to like the player that recruits their teammate into the play and makes it an 80-20 instead of a 50-50 is the player that's going to win like pretty much all the time.
Right. Yeah. If
So,
you want to look at it purely mathematically, the player who's the best aimer in the world is maybe 60-40 against the average
mhm,
player. But
yeah,
when you add a flash and, a KO knife, that quickly swings to be 80-20 the other way.
yeah, 100%, 100%. Um, yeah, I mean, when there's so much about the development of younger players is just like completely missing from the infrastructure of esports more widely, but definitely in Valorant, it feels like they're starting to get something to that in that area in like League of Legends, and they're what like 12 years in at this
Hmm.
point. Um, I don't have a ton of hope for in the next next couple years that there's suddenly like the fantastic infrastructure for these players, and so I think there's even more emphasis for coaches to be these sort of like one-stop shop in terms of like yes, be somebody in the coach slot who's going to take a timeout and have a banger strat ready,
Hmm.
based on the reads, but also be somebody who can be the equivalent of several years of farm league to get you into a position where you're like the most actualized version of yourself, and it can be a lot. It can definitely be a lot
Totally.
to be all that.
So in your opinion, what would you say actually makes a great player? I know we talked a little bit about being
Mhm.
receptive to feedback, but if you had to sort of like construct like the ultimate paragon of Valorant, or just a general esports competitor, like what sort of, you know make it like an MMO. You're creating your character sheet. Like what are the attributes that you're clicking? Obviously mechanics is part of it,
Um,
but what else are you adding to that?
sure. I think that communication with your teammates, both in terms of like I think most people would estimate like comms as one of those like dexterity, charisma strats that
Hmm.
you just or stats that most people have a conception of your comms being a super important building block, but not just your comms in game, but your ability to articulate and solve problems with your teammates in a constructive way. And it's not just about criticism; it's about like there's an issue presenting itself. Can you talk to somebody in a way that makes them feel like you're working together as opposed to working against one another just because, by the nature of who's talking at what times? Do you interrupt people? Like just really basic stuff. And what's interesting is that a lot of the stuff that makes you excellent in other fields that are outside of gaming make you similarly excellent as a pro player. And I think there's this, you shouldn't neglect these sorts of things because, like, I'm a gamer. I don't need to have,
Right.
like, regular skills. That stuff is incredibly important. So, decision making, super, super important. Communication, super important. Mechanics are definitely up there. I think there should be, uh, I mean, drive is
Hmm.
pretty insane, and a lot of people will say they have drive, but when you put people on a really grueling schedule, like our team until this past tournament was on like we were practicing like 8-9 hours a day, and then I would have them go watch back the VOD of all of the scrims.
Hmm.
Um, Afterward, I mean, they didn't have anything besides Valorant for like 3 months. And you start to see what real drive looks like. When I get like a DM at 3 a.m. after, practice, where it's like, hey, we've been doing this one particular thing in this way in this one strat, and I think it's more efficient if I start to do it from this way because I've seen this situation play out a couple times in the VOD, and I'm always put in a bad spot. You go, okay, that player really wants it,
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Doing the extra work outside of all of this intensive
yeah,
work already being done for sure.
of course. Yeah, it's the above and beyond that really separates people. Which is not to like say that you have to do that to conclusively find success. I think there's a balance there, but I think we were coming from a place where we were not happy with our results, and we were going to do anything that we could do to get above that.
Yeah, sure.
So.
And that's a really good point because another thing that has become like kind of a big conversation topic over the last several years is just like
Mhm.
burnout in general.
Yeah.
And so I think it is important to also talk about, okay, so you're working a huge amount of hours and this person is putting in a bunch of extra time, and
Hmm.
maybe for that person it's great, but then for the other people or a totally different person, maybe they can't do 10 to 12 hours of focused practice, but they can give you like 100% for 5,
Hmm.
and sometimes even that is enough. But I do think it's really important to be able to get to that 100% from people, because there's a lot of other stuff that's happening in people's lives. They might have
Yeah, for
family
sure.
issues, they might just simply not be able to sit at a computer for 9 hours a
Hmm.
day, and maybe
Yeah.
they do their best thinking on the game while taking their dogs for a walk, or
Hmm.
running or something like that as well. But I do think that you will certainly notice the difference between what like an 80% every day is and like 100%, and that being able to provide like the 100% effort, the 100% focus on a regular basis is like unbelievably important and hugely impactful in like separating um the people that make it from those that don't.
Yeah, I think it's super difficult to give 100% on a consistent
Yeah.
basis for most people, but I think, most people can give you pretty close if they have what it takes, they can give you something close to that on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think burnout's super like it's an important topic. I think that um ultimately it comes down to like, you know, being in tune with yourself,
Hmm.
and being very aware of like, okay, what is my body telling me? At what point am I noticing there's less efficacy in terms of like the task that I'm trying to accomplish right now? Okay, like can this task be done with like a less efficient mind? Like or like present, can
Hmm.
I is this something that I need to be super present for, or I can still get the benefit of with a little bit more scattered,
Sure.
focus. Um, which, I think it ultimately comes down to the individual, but I definitely worked with people in terms of like, okay, what do you need all of your presence for? And what can you do and still get some benefit out of when you're a little bit less present?
Yeah, totally. And
Yeah.
also that's another area of like where it comes to the skill of the coach is how are you able to pull the growth out of somebody who might not be able to give you 100% in that moment, because you know th- like you said, you're not going to get 100% focus from everybody all the time, and yet as a coach you still need to make sure that there is like consistent progress
Hmm.
towards the end goal.
Yeah, there's a lot of times late into a practice day where, people are starting, you can notice people started sort of sliding away a little
Hmm.
bit, and getting a little doing things that they know are wrong, because or they only realize a little bit later, and sort of bringing back, stating the purpose of the practice. What are you trying to get out of it? Being really, really specific with that stuff, and saying, remember the purpose of this scrim. We're trying to focus on these things. Bringing them back into that often does a lot. And it's very simple, but just restating what the purpose of that practice is, and trying to get as granular as possible with the specifics of that. Like, okay, are we working on retakes? Are we working on uh we working on like a retake in which we like give the site fully? Are we working on like floods to try and deal with them like getting into site as quickly as possible? Um, when we notice that there's there's a lot of different things that you can be very specific with, or just like, hey, we're going to try this particular setup. Like we're going to limit test this a little bit and
Hmm.
see like what are the different options that happen out of this default. Let's run this default 12 rounds in a row. You know,
Right.
um, so I think that that stuff helps a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious how much you focus with your team on like the team as a whole versus like working with individual players, because I feel like that's always an interesting thing. You know, some people
Mhm.
may need to be brought up to speed in certain areas, and sometimes you have to, you know, make sure that the whole team is working on one particular concept.
Mhm.
So what's your philosophy as far as like individual versus team focus during practice?
Um, I my approach is basically to just do one-on-ones like pretty regularly that are not just an opportunity for me to go deep on like a specific skill that is like usually role specific with a player, but also an opportunity like there's team wide goals of what we're working on, but there's also individual goals that I'm like keeping them up to speed on. Like, okay, this is something I see consistently from you that's an issue. Here's how we're going to work on it. Here are some very specific ideas of like how to curb that, and then like let's check back in the next one-on-one on like how that went. You know,
Hmm.
was that working for you? Is there something else? What did you notice about this process? And then it becomes an ongoing conversation with the individual. So it's about like goals. It's about like imparting knowledge when helpful. Like, hey, I noticed you're in this situation a lot of the time where you need this information, or you have sort of a want for like what your utility could do, and I'll like have found a lineup and like give it to them for like what I think would be best suited to that.
Hmm.
But I would say that right now the focus for the most part is like 90% on the team.
Hmm.
And then like I'll fill in like small gaps with individuals. But those one-on-ones are also an opportunity for them to like let loose about what are some of the things, like it's a emotional check-in as well. Like
Hmm.
what are the things that are going right? What are the things that are going wrong? Is there something that's not being addressed in the team right now that you feel is super important, that like it's an opportunity for players to have sort of like a lever on me of like, here's an opportunity for feedback of like, not necessarily so that they can steer the team for me, but so that like there isn't like this resentment built up of like, I wish like this so and so would stop doing this. But
Hmm.
like, I don't want to bring that up in a team environment because that's going to be pretty direct criticism that might be taken not so well.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, totally. And also, even as a coach, you don't necessarily want to be like the big boss. I mean, like you kind of
Mhm.
are, but you don't want to be necessarily seen as that. It is like a collaborative effort between you and the players to create this cohesive unit. So
100%.
giving them the space to feel like they can, um, you know, give you feedback even about like how everything is going, and not
Oh
feel,
yeah,
yeah,
I welcome that. I love that stuff. Because, everyone has blind spots.
right.
I have a conception of what I think it takes to get into a good team, but I might even within my own structure not be paying attention to certain things that I agree with.
Mm,
So it's an opportunity for a player to restate, like, hey, you say you want this, like I think we should do this to accomplish that. I'm like, hell yeah, that's great. Of course. I'm so glad that you told me this, because it is always a collaborative effort. If you come in and you say like I'm boss man and all of you are my minions, like that just doesn't work at all. And I think a lot of coaches do that unintentionally.
right.
If you don't create the space for them to talk to you about the stuff very actively, and almost some players it's hard to get out of them, because they don't want to be seen as a problem, or they don't want to just generally like rock the boat in any way. Sometimes you have to really work on them to be like, no, really, like, you're a part of this team. What do you want?
Mm,
Is there something here that is getting missed? Like, how can we elevate you?
hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and
yeah.
individual motivations, like everybody has different things that motivate them to
Hmm.
to strive for success and to try and hit that next level. And for some people, it might be the attention, it might be the money, it might be just like a battle against their own like self uh ego or perception of self, and trying to prove it to themselves or to parents.
Hmm.
That's an interesting one. I guess it's getting better these days, but growing up for me, and I assume you as well, there's probably not a whole lot of support for video gaming from the generation before us, as far as,
Nah.
you know oh, hey mom, I'm gonna go be a pro gamer. You're what? you know do you need to be sent
Yeah.
to a boarding school?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that I I definitely came at it from like a later perspective, like a later point in my life. I wasn't introduced to like competitive games until I was like 18.
Hmm,
And I wasn't nearly good enough to even ponder going pro at that point. But yeah, I think there's there's definitely a lot of room for like the institution being normalized, you
sure.
know. And that's also something that I think has been helpful for me as like somebody who's got some level of like, oh, clinical psychology, like so I can talk to parents and be like, listen, your kid's not screwing up right now
Right.
by like pursuing this. This is a viable path. I can show you all these different metrics by which you might be, persuaded to be more interested, or accept at the very least that your kid is like this is something that they're passionate about and usually quite superlative at.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I've never had to have any of those types of conversations, but
Mhm.
I'm sure they still do happen even in today's day and age, where esports is a lot more normalized.
Definitely.
Okay, let me ask you. Let me actually set a scene for you,
Please.
and I'm curious how you would handle this. So let's say that you've just had sort of a very tough game. It doesn't really matter whether you've won or lost, in my
Hmm.
opinion. But let's just say that the game didn't feel great to play. It didn't
Hmm.
feel great to watch as a coach. You're a little bit frustrated with how the team played because maybe you weren't doing, like, they weren't doing stuff that you guys have worked on, and
Hmm.
that they know they're supposed to be doing. Um, and the comms in the team, that while you're listening to them, are getting more and more frustrated.
Hmm.
So whether this is after the game or in a timeout during the game, what sort of approach do you take to like solving the conflict that's happening? Maybe people are arguing
Hmm.
about utility or who should be where,
Hmm.
or whose fault it is that you're losing these rounds.
Hmm.
How do you solve that conflict while also dealing with your own frustration towards the fact that you know that you're better than this, and you've taught them to do things better, but it's
Hmm.
still not happening?
Yeah. Um, so I have a policy in my teams that unless it is something that is very macro oriented, something that is like um, we are uh, doing certain things where um, like we're not paying attention to this part of the map a lot and they're getting value out of that. Unless it's something that is like that very broadly applicable to upcoming rounds, we just don't talk about it. Like I just say, just shut up. Like it's not relevant. If someone brings up something that happened in a 3v3 or something like that, where it's like, oh, we should have like flashed with the dart or something. I'm like, why the hell are we talking about this? This is absolutely useless for the next couple rounds because these situations don't unfold in similar ways, really, like round to round. So if that was happening in my team at this point, I would be like, next round,
Hmm.
and they would know that as shorthand for like this is a useless conversation. Let's move on. Um,
Sure.
but if it was after the game,
Mhm.
um, there's definitely been times where that has happened, and my approach is generally to look for some solutions. And with the earlier point about trying to elevate or maybe subsume some of the voices that need to be like brought into a median, some sort of level within the team. I'll be like, okay, I want to hear from everybody. What did you notice about yourself in this game? What did you notice about the team? And so, we'll get into certain things like, oh, we weren't doing this thing enough. I was like, oh, and then it'll be like, okay, why was that happening? And someone else might chime in with saying like, it's, I just felt like I couldn't do this because this other thing was happening. And you start to unfold, um, like a larger picture of how the system is not working properly, and it is a problem with the system, as opposed to like this person didn't do this one thing.
Hmm.
Because that's usually, I mean, Valorant is such an incredibly complex game that you can't usually locate the problems solely in one person. That's not really how that works. It's usually because a series of different players are like interacting in and like operating on one another in ways that they don't understand, and that like all they know is something's wrong because it's not happening the way that it usually happens. But in the moment, it's usually pretty difficult, especially for players who aren't at the absolute top echelon, to figure out why that isn't happening right. And I think that that's honestly one of the things that separates like tier two players from tier one players is an immediate awareness and like diagnosis of the problem, that is like correct and efficient and quick, because you start to notice that like, um, when I was working with the XSET men's team, if something was going wrong, they were like incredibly efficient at figuring out what was going wrong and why,
Hmm.
and then fixing it. And that was something that, that is a level of play that I had never really experienced, like, a continental champion level play.
Hmm.
And I really think that it's because they were so understanding of like what the interactions between each other usually look like when they're working, that they could just instantly see is what was going wrong, and fix it. And so they were a tremendously adaptable team in that like a team might be able to seize on some sort of pocket of space or opening that, the team wasn't aware of, but pretty quickly they'd catch on. And so, you'd watch a scrim where they'd go down 0-4, and then they'd be like, oh, they're doing this based on this. Okay, so we're going to move here. You pick up this. Okay, done. And then just 20-4 that scrim from then
Hmm.
on, because they would just steamroll a team because they had just understood what was going to happen now, or like what they needed to do to beat that. And that is honestly what I think elevates you. Your ability to figure that stuff out on the fly is that's what makes a tier one competitor. So, but like so often in these conversations about, what makes an excellent player, it's really, that's like pretty low on the priority list.
Hmm. Yeah, I
But
mean, adaptability and creativity, like
mhm,
spontaneous creativity, is so underrated when it comes to competition, because being able to like assimilate, digest knowledge
mhm,
based on what you're seeing and experiencing, and then in that moment create a solution is it's
mhm,
like it's almost like a superhuman skill, to be honest. Like a lot of like, the
mhm.
great scientific breakthroughs were literally somebody just like cognizing like, oh, this is the answer to this math problem that people have been working on for 40 years or whatever.
Yeah,
It's the same kind of thing where it's just like the pieces fall into place and then your brain just kind of like does the work subconsciously almost, and
it it
presents you
it
with a solution.
defies understanding in a
Yeah.
certain respect.
Yeah.
I mean, the understanding itself, the fact that one is able to come to that understanding, like when the flip is switched, it's like you don't know why that happens,
Yeah.
or you can only kind of hope to create the conditions where that'll happen, and then, you know and that's something I learned from Dawn, is also like, knowing how to, psycho,
Hmm.
like knowing as a coach when to be a modulator of the various voices that are all very strong and knowledgeable within a group, as opposed to let me just throw my voice on top of everything.
Right.
And I think that that's, at an elite level, when you have so many like great minds in the team, a lot of that comes down to how can I get the best out of everyone by, um, synergizing, every all of these different strands of thought and coming up with a unified team, response to something.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a great point. So speaking of kind of like setting up the conditions for being able to do these things, so to
Mhm,
perform at an elite level, and you don't have to give me any secret sauce if there's some special thing that you do, but I'm just
mhm,
curious if there's any sort of like pregame rituals or in-game rituals that you have with your teams that you're working with,
mhm.
to kind of like put them in the right space to perform their best.
Yeah, so this remains a journey for me. I think when I first came in to coaching, I didn't want to be too much of a dominant voice and like dictate. And I think there was sort of like a some sense of like not wanting to put myself out there with this. But I started doing and having some success with pre-game meditations.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that for some teams, it was really successful and helpful. Some players, especially, and a lot of that is, I mean, it's like scientifically proven that visualization is like an incredible tool for accomplishing goals.
Hmm.
Um, like and also creating like positive self-talk mantras. And so what I would do before matches is like create this long meditation that's like a guided meditation where I would just have the players close their eyes and I would sort of speak like an audiobook of about what was about to happen.
Interesting.
Um, and I would be like, we're gonna win the pistol round because we do this, and like we read what they're doing, and then we respond perfectly, and then on the anti-eco, like as specific as that,
Hmm.
and the players would get very invested and sort of visualize this in as clear of a detail as possible. And for some players, this was super powerful. Um, but I also ran into a situation more down the line with subsequent teams that can put almost too much importance on a match. It can make a match feel too different from
Mm.
practice.
Interesting.
And so for some players that like takes them out of the optimal sort of like emotional level for a flow state.
Hmm.
So what I have found is that I think for the average player, that's actually not such a great thing. And it felt like because I have this expertise and understanding, I should make this sort of thing. But ultimately, you're working with players. You're not working with ideas of players,
Hmm.
or the general player. So what I found, sorry about that. What I found worked the best, at least for this team, is we spend like an hour or two before matches just hanging out
Hmm.
and like doing and just like riffing with each other and just making jokes and um like kind of just bantering and keeping the vibe very like light and like maybe we'll play like a game of Smash or something or something that's entirely irrelevant to what we're about to do so that there's this sort of like jokey like not taking anything too serious vibe and that can actually just win you a match.
Hmm.
Because if you feel like that off top, like if you guys are laughing and you're treating it like it doesn't matter at all, a lot of times that is the optimal way to play the game.
Yeah.
Because when you're having fun, that's the most consistent way to access flow state. And so all the anti-strats and like all the important prep, um, in terms of like your playbook and all this sort of stuff that we conventionally think of as like super important to the success of a team in an organized competitive environment. Um, that stuff has to all come secondary to some degree to the vibes. You must surrender to the vibes. I think it's like the most important thing that you can emphasize as a coach, and I think that too often it's like, well, I'm the super analytical guy, and I'm here to impart knowledge. Like you gotta cultivate those vibes like your life depends on it. So you gotta crack jokes, you gotta play the fool, you gotta do anything. Um, yeah, you gotta do absolutely anything you can to make sure that you protect the vibes at all costs.
Protect the vibes. That's such a good mantra. That's actually just a really great spot to end the conversation. I think like
Mm,
that. It's just, I mean, that encapsulates everything that a coach is supposed to do. Is just like put
definitely.
people in the right mind state to perform their best, and those performances will happen. So, Dan, well, thank you so much for your time
Of course.
and the knowledge that you shared with us
Absolute
today.
pleasure.
Go ahead and tell people what you're up to this next few months, or where people can find you if they want some more vibe coaching.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at DANIMAL'S. On the very, very rare occasion that I stream, I'll be at twitch.tv/CoachDanimal. But generally just on Twitter, and happy to talk to anyone who is in need of a vibe check. Um, and for 2023, just reconnoitering, getting the roster together, and ready for 2023 and next year's Game Changers.
Awesome. Well, best of luck this year, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time again.
Appreciate it.